This morning, I want to entitle my presentation New Covenant Eyes, New Covenant Eyes, or the Eyes of the New Covenant. And I am simply wanting to emphasize something that I believe we all know theoretically very well. But under this heading, I want to just look a little bit at it again, at the topic again, and perhaps to refresh our thoughts and to help to refocus those thoughts. One of the things that I sometimes sense is that we're all ministers and subjects of the new covenant, but sometimes we don't apply the principles of the new covenant consistently. And that is one of the problems with Christendom in general, because they have a hybrid religion which is part old covenant and part new covenant. They embrace the new covenant but still apply and live by principles of the old covenant. So I hope that in one aspect, at least one aspect, this morning we can focus a little bit more fully on the meaning of the new covenant. And so I want to entitle my presentation New Covenant Eyes. New Covenant Eyes. I'll go to my Bible as always, share my screen, and I want to start off with what I'm going to refer to as Jesus's mandate. You know, a mandate is a commandment, or it's something that is required or something that is desirable. And Jesus's mandate, I am reading from John chapter 4, verse 24. Jesus says, God is a spirit, or God is spirit. I understand that in the Greek it says, God is spirit. The "a" is not there. God is spirit. And they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. I refer to it as a mandate because a mandate means something that you're impelled to do, you're compelled to do. And usually a mandate begins with the word must. You must do. So Jesus says, those who worship God, if we truly worship God, we're required to, we're obligated to worship him in a certain way. And he mentioned that this way is in spirit and in truth. We have discussed this principle over and over. I'm sure that I don't need to go back into the details of what it means to worship in spirit and in truth. As a matter of fact, Jesus said in the previous verse that this is how the true worshiper shall worship. Wow. When I think of this, it strikingly comes home to my mind that there are many who are not true worshipers. Because it says the true worshiper shall worship the Father in spirit as well as in truth. All right. Now, even though we have looked at this many times over, I just want to briefly revise or rehearse or reinforce what these two things mean. Some people think that when it says in the spirit, it means that you behave like the Pentecostals. You get into the spirit and you shout and you cry and you jump about and you make a lot of noise. And they say, this is what spirit means. And some others say that when you talk about the truth, what it means is that you are doctrinally correct. You have the right doctrines about the Sabbath and the 2300 days and the state of the dead and eternal hell and all the rest of it. You have the correct doctrines, and that is what truth means. But you know, we have, well, I have expressed it differently. I've introduced it on with different perspective, and I hope we remember. I'm going to write them on the board again on the screen. So to worship in spirit, let me write it here. And what do we understand this to mean? Let me make it a little bigger. In spirit means not in a physical way. And truth means reality, not illustration. All right. So let's just take a moment and look at those two things. Jesus says those who worship must worship in spirit. And I've emphasized that it means not in a physical way. And what do we mean by this? Well, you know, in the old covenant, they had to worship in a physical temple. Israel was a physical people. The lamb that was slain was a physical lamb. Life was physical blood. The life was in the blood. Everything that was in the old covenant system of worship had to do with things that were seen, smelled, tasted, touched, or heard. Everything that was involved in the old system of worship had to do with things that were discernible by your five senses. When Jesus says in the new covenant, those who worship God will worship in spirit, it means that our spirit will not be, our worship will not be based on what we can see, smell, taste, touch, or hear. That basically is what spirit is. And what about truth? Truth is not used here in opposition to what is false. Truth here means the genuine article instead of an illustration or a photograph or a model or a type or a shadow. And we can see that very clearly when John says in John 1 and verse 17 that the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. When it says truth came by Jesus Christ, he was not saying that there was no truth before Jesus came, no doctrinal truth. What he's saying is that before Jesus came, there was not the real thing. There was illustration, there was shadow, there was type, there was representation, there was the model. Jesus brought the real thing or the truth. I hope we all can understand that. So I want to emphasize this, to get this riveted in our minds as we continue with our discussion for this morning. So Jesus says those who worship must, it's a mandate, must worship God in spirit and in truth. In other words, what this means, brothers and sisters, is that our worship of God must be based on the things that are real. And they are not based on physical things. They are not based, our worship is not based on things that we can see, smell, taste, touch, or hear. Because if we do, we're worshiping not in spirit, but we are worshiping in the physical. And Jesus says God is not looking for those kinds of worshipers. Those were the worshipers of the old covenant. They were the ones that their religion was based on tangible, material things. I feel so strongly about this because it is such a subtle deception. Because there are so many Christians who are obsessed with physical things. I know that there have been members of my family who have been, I don't mean my immediate family, but they have been what I would almost say superstitious, okay? They think that if you touch something, it can harm you. They think that if you get in close proximity to something, you can be spiritually affected. It's the same kind of thing that Jesus tried to get across in his dealing with the Jews when he says, nothing that enters a man can defile him. It's the same thing Paul meant when he says, if you are risen with Christ, why are you still subject to ordinances? Touch not, taste not, handle not. These things are all to perish with the using. Why are you still subject to these kinds of limitations if you now live as a spiritual person in the new covenant? What he's pointing out is that our worship is not based upon physical, but upon spiritual. In Philippians 3 and verse 3, Paul says, we are the circumcision. Just an example of what this means. We are the circumcision. What is circumcision? It is the removal of the foreskin from the male organ. It's a physical activity. It's a physical removal. You see it and you feel the pain, and for the rest of your life, you live in this condition. Paul says we are the circumcision. What Paul is talking about has nothing to do with something physical. You don't feel that pain. You don't see blood. You don't feel something being cut off. But he says, we are the circumcision. He says, which worship God in the spirit. He's referring here to the same thing that Jesus said. We worship God in the Spirit. And Paul is explaining here that what this means is that we don't operate on the basis of the physical. And he emphasizes it. And we rejoice in Christ Jesus, and we have no confidence in the flesh. We have no confidence in physical things. We have never been, most of us have never been physically circumcised. Some people do it for health reasons. Most of us men have never been physically circumcised. I would suggest that maybe this is true for the people in this room. We have never possessed physical Jewish blood. This is one of the things that we are so adamant in opposing when we look at the people who are into the Black Hebrew Israelite movement. Okay, they have turned. They are trying to turn history upside down, and because they were once oppressed by white people, they have reversed it now, and they are trying to find an identity in the idea that they, by flesh and blood, are the true Israelites, and they are special to God because of the blood that is in their veins. Absolute nonsense. Paul says we have no confidence in the flesh because God is spirit. And those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. And if our worship is not based on spirit and the things that are real, we're not really worshiping God. These are not the kinds of worshipers that God is looking for. In Romans 2 and verse 29, Paul again highlights the same point because he says, he is a Jew which is one inwardly, where you can't see it. You can't hear, touch, feel, smell. And circumcision of the heart in the spirit and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men but of God. So these three verses, brothers and sisters, emphasize the point I'm trying to make, that we have a mandate. We as Christians, our mandate is to worship God in spirit and in truth. Now, I want to say something to us in a general way. We can't look at all the aspects of what this means. We can't. We don't have the time. It's a huge subject. But I want to say this to us, brothers and sisters. All of us are exposed to different things day by day. We have religious discussions with other people. We meet up with arguments on Facebook. We watch things on YouTube. We interact with people on a personal level. And all the time, we are being bombarded. And our religion is being challenged. I want to put this to us. What are the principles on which we operate? When Paul was dealing with the Galatians, one of the things that disappointed him most of all, as a matter of fact, I could read it. One of the things that disappointed him greatly was how easily they moved away from the principles of the spiritual religion that he had taught them. Look at what he says. Galatians 3 verse 1. O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth? Now, what was the problem with the Galatians? The problem was that they were seeking to go back to physical religion, right? We understand that the problem was that they were going back to circumcision and the works of the law. But understand the principle. It's not circumcision per se. It's not the law per se. It's physical religion that is the problem. Do you understand what I'm saying? The law was only the way it manifested itself among these people. But the problem is that they were moving away from spiritual worship and going back to physical worship. And Paul says, if you're a Jamaican, you understand. Who obia you? Who obia you? Obia is a Jamaican form of witchcraft. Who cast a spell on you? Because this is what disappoints him. And you know, last night, Brother Ladd asked me a question that I've had to consider many times. He says, if I'm not sometimes disappointed because are tired or weary of the many religious arguments and discussions and having to be involved in them over and over. And you know, I told him quite frankly that, well, the arguments, they don't bother me that much. Sometimes I find that by getting into some of these discussions, it strengthens me. It makes me better able to understand the things that I believe. But I did confess, and I still say that what disappoints me is when you're involved with brethren, and we all understand and share together and understand principles, and then it comes to the place that all of a sudden you hear that people are gone into feast keeping, or they are gone into the new moon Sabbaths, or they are gone into the doctrine that God does not kill. And you think of all the times you went through these things together, you went through these principles together, and you find that people are so gullible and easily deceived. And that is what bothers me. That is what bothers me. It's the ease with which people forget principles. There are underlying principles to our religion, and if you get the principles right, you will be safeguarded from many of these deceptions. And this is a principle that Jesus gave us. We worship God in spirit and in truth. All right, so this is our mandate. This is what Jesus says we must do. If we worship God, we are to worship in spirit and in truth. Our religion is based upon the things that are not seen, not heard, not tasted, not touched, not smelled. This is our religion. Jesus gave us a few other examples of what he's talking about. Look at this. John 6, verses 51 to 52. Look at this. Jesus says, I am the living bread which came down from heaven. All right, so he's talking about physical worship because he mentions bread, and bread is physical. So he seems to be focusing on physical worship. He said, if any man eat of this bread, he shall live forever. So you guess that something is a little different here because he says we must eat the bread and he's the bread. So if you are smart, you begin to pick up that he's not saying we are to eat him. But then he goes on to reinforce the illustration, and he says, and the bread that I will give is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. Now the Jews, being like many modern Christians, of course, were completely confused. And in verse 52, it says, the Jews therefore strove among themselves, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? You perceive what is happening. They don't have spiritual insight. They don't have spiritual understanding. Their religion is so material based. They cannot understand the spiritual statements that Jesus makes. He says we must eat his flesh, and he's giving his flesh for the world. And if we eat this, we will live forever. And they are there debating among themselves, how are we going to eat it? They are thinking of cutting him to pieces, putting him in a pot and cooking him, or frying him in the frying pan and eating the flesh. You know, it's gross. And you wonder, how could they be so simplistic? But I wonder sometimes if we don't find ourselves falling into the same kind of trap because we don't apply the same principles consistently. That's a challenge we have as Christians. We're not consistent in how we apply our principles. In verse 63 of the same passage, Jesus says, it is the spirit that quickeneth. Again, we look at the principle of worshiping God in spirit. He said it is a spirit that quickeneth, and quickeneth means what? It makes alive. It is a spirit that makes alive. The flesh means nothing. So he's telling them, when I told you to eat my flesh, I didn't mean eat my flesh. I meant you are to partake of my spirit, because the flesh is nothing. He's telling you that physical things are meaningless. They have nothing to do with the worship in the spirit. He's telling you that the physical things are not the things that we are to pay attention to. But even then, he goes on to say something else that is also misunderstood, because he says, the words that I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life. And some of our brethren today, we know, have taken this to mean that the spirit is the words. The words themselves are the agency of the spirit. So they move from one error into another error because they still don't understand spirit and in truth. Words are things that you can see. They're on the paper. All of us are looking at them now. They're on the screen. Words are things that you can hear. I'm speaking them and you are listening. So words in themselves are not spirit and they are not life. But words are used to convey to us things that are spirit and things that are life. So as we hear the words of Christ, and as we believe in those words, we can receive the things that those words speak about. I'm not going to dwell on that too much this morning, but I just want to emphasize that point. In 1 Corinthians 2, the Apostle Paul highlights a little bit more what it means to be involved in things of the Spirit. And look at what he says. He said, your eye has not seen. All right, so you have the sense of your eye. Your ear has not heard. So there are two senses that are at work. Your eyes and your ears. None of them have been called into this. And I'll tell you, nose has not smelled it. Tongue has not tasted it. And hands have not felt it either. He could have gone through the whole spectrum of the five senses and he could have said the same thing. None of these things have been able to discern what? What? The things which God has prepared for them that love him. All right, so Paul talks about the senses and he says, these things have not been able to discern the things that God has given to us. But look what he said in verse 10. But God has revealed them to us by his Spirit. Here is a revelation beyond the five senses. For the Spirit searches all things, yes, the deep things of God. But he goes down to say in verse 14, but the natural man, who is that? The natural man is the man who is worshiping in the way of the old covenant. The natural man is the one who is not led by the Spirit of God, who is not born of the Spirit of God, who does not understand the things of the Spirit. The natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness unto him. Why? Neither can he know them, because they are spiritually discerned. Brothers and sisters, we're talking about the new covenant. And what the point I want to make is that the things of the new covenant, the things of the Spirit, the problem with the things of the Spirit is that the senses of the flesh cannot discern spiritual things. You can't obtain it by going to a school to obtain head knowledge, things that go through your ears and your eyes to obtain information. You can't get it by going on Facebook or YouTube or WhatsApp. You can't get these things because spiritual things are spiritually discerned. The natural man does not receive these things. The natural man is focused on the physical things. When you look at the three angels' messages, one of the things that gave me, well, it didn't give me a challenge, but when I came to understand this a little better, I was very happy because the three angels' messages, all my life, they were presented to me as warnings against physical encroachments. Well, they said the judgment in heaven. I guess they would say that wasn't a physical thing, but they would say that is happening in heaven, and down here you have to be preparing in case your name is called. I thought that the messages we were to give to the world was Babylon has fallen, and beware of the mark of the beast. And for many years, while that was my emphasis, I spent my time trying to prepare physically for the mark. I got myself extremely fit. Like I tell you, one time I was running, like every morning I was doing 10 miles. And like on a Sunday morning, I would run 18 miles. My brother and I, Tony, before he died, we would run 18 miles. We did that for a number of years. And, I did my best to be prepared for that. Whatever came, I knew I would be ready. The thing is that, I started having a family and my wife couldn't run as fast or as far. And I had started having little children who couldn't run. And then I started to get old and my bones started to get creaky. I started to get pull muscles. I couldn't run as far. I couldn't run as fast. And I realized, that if I'm preparing for the crisis, I know one person, as I said, at least one person who has food well, at least up to a couple of years ago, he had food stored up from the year 2000, preparing for the shutdown of the world. I know many people I know a brother here in Jamaica he was a ship's captain, a ship's navigator. He gave up his job, came home and bought land in the hills of St. Thomas. And he has been living there as a hermit for the past at least 25 years, maybe more than that. He doesn't come to town except maybe once every few months he might come down to civilization. He has migrated to the mountains. For what purpose? I hardly know what for. The point I'm making, I came to realize that the third angel's message is not a message to tell people to physically fight back. Anybody who is planning to fight back against the mark of the beast, you are in the wrong kind of fight. You don't understand what is going on. The message of the three angels' message. The three angels' message is a focus to fear God and give glory to Him. It's a focus on God and on His Son. That is our safety. All the parables you can look at in the Bible tell us that our safety is in our relationship with Christ. The wise virgins, they had the oil in their lamps. The relationship with Christ was intact, so even though they fell asleep, they were safe. Our safety, brothers and sisters, is in worshiping God in spirit and in truth. And as the crisis grows greater, we bind ourselves more completely to Christ. That is our answer. So look here. Does anybody live under the illusion that our safety from the mark of the beast is to resist the system or to hide from the system? Is that our safety? I can tell you about a man. I was reading it in Josephus, a man who went about in Jerusalem for 3 years, predicting the destruction of Jerusalem. A voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds. Woe, woe, woe to Jerusalem. 3 years. And when the siege came, when finally they conquered Jerusalem, he was killed in the siege. What I'm saying is, you know, you've heard the saying that the safest place to be in the world is within the will of God. So when Paul was being beheaded by, I think it was Nero, when Paul was being beheaded by Nero, it was the safest place in the world for Paul. When Peter was in prison, it was the safest place in the world for Peter. When Elijah was being hunted by Jezebel, it was the safest place in the world for Elijah. What I'm saying, brothers and sisters, as Christians, our relationship with the Lord is the most important thing. And the physical environment is what God places around us, is where God chooses to put us. So anyway, I drifted off a little bit from my theme, but let's get back on track. So Paul says that the things of the Spirit of God, they are not known by the natural man. He cannot receive them. And the problem is that there are so many Christians who they lay claim to the new covenant, but they are still firmly rooted in the religion of the eyes and the ears and the nose and the taste and the smell. Even among those who claim to be evangelicals, they are obsessed with physical Israel. They think that physical Israel, the physical Jews, are still God's special people. Many of them are obsessed with America. They say America is the new Israel, new Palestine, where God has special favor over this place of real estate. They think God is a God of real estate. These are the perverted, what should I say, mongrelized ideas that come in and mingle with the new covenant. And I'm saying to us, brothers and sisters, it is my desire that all of us in this room might be able to make that clear distinction between the principles of the old covenant and the principles of the new. The thing about the new covenant, well, I'm going to get to this. Let me not get ahead of myself. The challenge that we have You know, as David put it in Psalm 84, verses 2 and 3, David says, "My soul longeth, yea, even fainteth for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh crieth out for the living God." What was David's problem? I think it's a similar problem that we have today. David wanted the presence of God. David wanted fellowship with God. And he expressed in poetry the agonized hungerings of his soul. He wanted it badly. I know all of us can empathize with this. David was even envious of the birds, right? Yea, the sparrow had found a house, and the swallow a nest for herself where she may lay her young, even thine altars. In other words, it seems what happened was that David saw that some of these birds went into the temple and made their nest there. And he was contrasting it with him. He wasn't able to go into the temple and live like the birds. And so he was saying even the birds were more privileged than him. But what did he want? He wanted an experience with God where he was constantly in the presence of God. Now, why did David have this problem? It was because primarily the worship of David's time was a worship that was physical. You see what I'm saying? For David to really have the presence of God, he felt like he needed to go into the temple, the courts of the Lord. His heart was crying out for the privilege of being there all the time. This is how it was under the worship of the old covenant. You had to be in a physical place, in a physical environment. He's longing for that fellowship. And the problem is that we find ourselves in the same situation because we can't hear God. We can't see God. We can't smell him, touch him, or taste him. Even though we get up this morning and we spend some time alone with him in the quiet and the dark, we are groping, trying to find him and to touch him and to feel him. And it's so hard. That is the problem. The problem is, although we want to live in the spiritual world, we want to live in the spiritual world. That is where Jesus said we should live. We want to live in the spiritual world, but we exist in the physical. You see what I'm saying? We exist in the physical. My body is here. My eyes are here. My ears are here. When I step out of this room, I will interact with things that are physical. Even in this room, I'm interacting with this curtain. It's physical. Everything about me that I'm seeing, you people, your images, it's physical. The one that I need most of all, he's here, but I can't see him, taste him, smell him. He's here, but I can't interact with him in the ways that I'm accustomed to. That's the problem we have. Between us, between us and God, Jesus said we should worship God in spirit and in truth. And he means not with the senses. But there's a problem because we have a barrier that I want to refer to as a sense barrier. There's the barrier of the eyes and the ears and the nose and the mouth and the hands. There's the barrier. These are the tools that I use to relate to reality. And there's a reality beyond these senses, and I can't cross that reality. And that is the barrier. That is my challenge. That is your challenge. It would be wonderful if we could open our eyes and see the angels and we could see God. It would be wonderful if we could actually rise up to heavenly places and see heaven and the way things are run there. I bet you all the false ideas would disappear. I bet you nobody would be worrying themselves about feast days and all the other things that people get so upset about. I bet they wouldn't be involved in those things. They would be focused on the spiritual realities of the new covenant. That's what would mean something to them. They'd be focused on the religion that is based on the spirit and the heart, and not the physical, tangible things that some are so obsessed with. We have this sense barrier that exists between us and the other world, and that is the real problem we have as Christians. That's why the Bible says we are to fight the good fight of faith. Paul says we are to fight the fight, and it's the fight of faith. It's the fight to bridge the barrier, to bridge the gap between us and the invisible world. We must operate in the invisible world when we exist in the physical world. That's our problem. And if you want to know what our fight is, brothers and sisters, that is our fight. Consequently, many people are starting to fight the battle in the physical world because they are relating to what they can discern with their senses. So they are relating to the battle in the physical world. But the scripture tells us, oh, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but spiritual. And they are mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. And when it says strongholds, it means principalities and powers in high places, in heavenly places. So we know, brothers and sisters, my enemy is not Joe Biden or Donald Trump or the American government or the English government. My enemy, the real enemy that we wrestle against, is Satan and his agencies. They work through these human agencies, but are we going to fight these human agencies? What are we going to do? Go out and buy an AK-47? What are we going to do? Go out on the street and rouse up the people and tell them to attack a government building? What are we going to do? No. The weapons of our warfare are mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, but they are not physical weapons because we are not wrestling against physical elements. You see what I'm saying? We belong in the spiritual world. Our battle is in the spiritual world because we are spiritual beings and we worship God in spirit and in truth. 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 18 says, let me read from verse 17. All right. For our light affliction, which is only for a moment, it works for us, or it works out for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. And what is Paul calling our light affliction? He's talking about people being thrown to wild beasts. He's talking about people being burned alive. He's talking about people being beheaded. And he calls it a light affliction. I guess some of us have yet to taste what this light affliction means. And no doubt when in the crisis that is coming, some of us are going to face this. Some of us are going to die. Some of us are going to be tortured. Some of us are going to suffer what the world might consider great tribulation. Paul refers to it as light affliction. Because he's seeing things spiritually. He's not obsessed with the physical. For the people of the world, this is not a light affliction. It's trauma, it's death. It's something to create a revolution about. Paul said it's a light affliction. Because we worship God in spirit and in truth, and we understand the reality of what is really important. Because he says in verse 18, while we look not at the things that are seen, praise the Lord, but at the things which are not seen. That's what we keep our eyes upon. For the things which are seen are temporal, meaning what? They are temporary and they are physical. They are of this world. But the things which are not seen are eternal. That's where we keep our eyes. And that's where God intends that we should keep our eyes. This is the religion of the new covenant, brothers and sisters. I'm so impressed with this because I look around, get onto some of the messages that are being preached and the things that are being said, and look at what people are emphasizing. And so much of religion today is based upon the physical. So much of it. It's like God doesn't exist. It's like spiritual things are fiction. It's like somebody would say, come on, Brother David, let's be practical. What? Spiritual things are not practical? Spiritual things are not real? Those who are of this world are obsessed with this world. Those who are of the world to come and those who are spiritual are obsessed with spiritual things. So what we can see here is that the spiritual things are invisible, they're intangible. So how do we interact with the spiritual things? And if we can't see them, touch them, hear them, smell them, how do we interact with them? Brothers and sisters, the answer is We interact with spiritual things through our thoughts, through our spirit, but our spirit finds expression through our thoughts. Thoughts are spiritual because thoughts cannot be seen, nor smelled, nor heard, nor tasted, nor touched. Thoughts are intangible. Thoughts are spiritual things. And so it is through the faculty of thought that we worship God in spirit and in truth. Now, it is true that what we think, it affects the physical part of us. Agreed. I agree. The physical part of us is where the inward part appears. All right. So there are certain things I won't do in the physical realm. I won't worship an idol. I won't commit adultery. I won't steal. Those are physical things. But those things are only the product of what goes on in the spirit. We have learned this lesson and we have taught this lesson and we have emphasized this lesson that sin is not simply what you do. That's the concept of the limited thinking. We believe that sin has to do with the nature of your spirit. So what is in the spirit is the most important thing. And when your spirit is right and when you worship God in spirit and in truth, the outward behavior follows naturally. You don't have adulterers among those who are born again. You don't have thieves. You don't have whoremongers. You don't have people who are obsessed with the things of the world. Why? Because the inside belongs to God. Because inside you are in connection with invisible spiritual things. And it shows on the outside. But it shows on the outside not because we are obsessed with the outside, but because we have found the right place for the inside. At the end of this, I want to pause a little bit even before we hand over to Brother Howard, because I want to know if there are any discrepancies or any holes in what I'm saying. You know, that if there are any questions, I want to try to respond to them. In Hebrews 11, verse 27, it says, speaking of Moses, by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. For he endured as, I like this phrase, as seeing him who is invisible. When last did you see somebody who is invisible? How can you see somebody who is invisible when the person is invisible? I've never seen an invisible person, but the Bible says Moses saw the one who is invisible. And this kind of tells you now, what is it? What sense is it that we use to worship in the spiritual realm? It tells you in this verse. It says it was by faith. So I'm going to say that the sense of the spirit or the eye of the spirit is this thing that we call faith. Faith is the tool that enables us to step across this barrier of the senses and to enter the spiritual realm. Remember, there are two worlds, there are two realms. One of them is physical, and in the physical realm, this is the only world that humanity knows, the physical realm. It's the only world that the world knows. It's the only environment that the world knows. And there are many human beings who say that if you cannot see it, touch it, taste it, it doesn't exist. That's why they don't believe in God. We say there's another world that is just as real. But people hardly believe it because many of us claim that this world exists, but we live for the present world. This is where I see you, Brother Matt. I'll come to you in a moment. This is where our energies. All right, I'm going to have to just mute everybody for the moment. I'll take the questions in a little bit. All right. This is where most people who even claim to be Christians live in the physical world. We have not been able to successfully bridge that barrier between the physical and the spiritual world. But here the Bible tells you that the bridge across both worlds is this thing called faith. This is why faith pleases God. This is why without faith it is impossible to please God, because faith is a faculty. It's the eye of the spirit. The eye of the spirit is faith. Because it says, faith is a substance of things hoped for. Faith is the evidence of things not seen. Through faith, we can step across this barrier and we can live in a world that others do not see because we are worshiping God in spirit and in truth. Think about it, brothers and sisters. That's why those people who have faith have done things that the world considers crazy. You're crazy. Somebody's passing by and he says to you, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. You're a fisherman, it's your living. You have done it all your life. It's the only job you know. You put down everything, you leave your boat, you leave your net, and you follow this man around for 3.5 years. You're crazy. Faith is seeing the things that others cannot see, because faith takes you over into that realm, into that arena. You don't live like the people who can only see this world. You don't seek after their gods. You don't look for their idols. You don't cherish their treasures, because your world, you are seeing it and they cannot see it. Faith is able to break this barrier between the two worlds. And look at what Jesus says in Revelation 3 and verse 18, when he's speaking to the Laodicean church. He says, I counsel you to buy of me gold tried in the fire, that thou mayest be clothed, mayest be rich, and white raiment, that thou mayest be clothed, and that the shame of thy nakedness do not appear. And look at the third thing he says. He says, and anoint your eyes with eye salve, that you may see. Again, Jesus is using physical faculties. He's talking about the faculty of eyesight, and he says, look here, you're not seeing. What are you to do? Go down to the ophthalmologist and get your eyes tested? Just let us understand that I'm asking a simplistic question, but you have to apply the same principle in every detail of our experience as new covenant believers. Where do we break away from the spiritual principle and start operating in the physical realm? You should never do this in any aspect of our religion at all. Jesus says, anoint your eyes with eye salve, that you may see. And we understand he's saying there is a faculty of sight. Some of the people who need this eye salve, they may have 20/20 vision physically. They don't need glasses like I do, but they are still blind and naked. And Jesus says, you need to see. So he's saying there's a faculty of sight that enables you to see in the spiritual realm. And that faculty, I believe, is a faculty of faith. That faculty of faith. The problem with faith, there's a problem with faith, and I just want to, we all know what it is, okay? I wish I could just believe this morning, and bang, I run into automatic, and I'm believing maximum, at the maximum level for the rest of my life. That would be so wonderful. I came back from South Africa on Wednesday. Thursday, I was half dead. When was it? Thursday, I was half dead. I was so tired. I was suffering from jet lag. I couldn't think or concentrate. I didn't even try to have the webinar. Friday, I was kind of spaced out. It's like all the muscles in my body were paining me for some reason that I can't explain. And I was weak and I could not concentrate, even to prepare for today. You know, they would say the vibes wasn't there. The clarity and the mindset were not there. And, you know, I was just thinking, my goodness, having faith is one thing, but what happens when you're dry and you're barren and you're empty and your mind just won't cooperate? How does faith work at that time? And, you know, I realize, I mean, I am asking the question, but I realize that faith is more than just a momentary thing. Because the faith that you have, the faith that I have spans 47 years. I'm happy to say, okay, I may be weak at times, I may be dry at times, but I've never let go. Praise God. In my weak moments, I still didn't let go. But what I'm saying is that faith, there's always a problem with faith because it is not always strong upon that high decibel. Sometimes it goes down and sometimes you can't concentrate. And so there's a fight. That's why Paul says, fight the good fight of faith. And what I want to just emphasize here in this final section of what I'm sharing this morning, I want to highlight a certain point, a certain principle that can help us to develop this faith and to maintain this faith. All right, that's what I want to emphasize in this last part here. Now I want to start with a couple of hard sayings by our Lord. Hard sayings. Almost impossible sayings. Jesus says in Luke 14 and verse 33, So likewise, whosoever he be of you that forsaketh not all that he has, he cannot be my disciple. This is a hard saying. Who can hear it? And just in case you think that it was a little exaggeration, I want you to look at what happened here in Mark 10, where a certain man came to him, a rich man, and asked him what he should do to inherit eternal life. What shall I do that I may inherit eternal life? And Jesus told him, you are lacking one thing. You are missing one thing. Go your way. Sell whatever you have. In another gospel, it says, sell everything you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, take up the cross and follow me. He might as well have told the man to go out and hang himself from a tree. This was death to this man, death to this man. But what is Jesus doing? I want you to look at what he's doing. He puts both worlds before the man. He puts both worlds before the man. This is what he's doing. What is he offering him? He's offering him treasure in heaven. Okay, that's world number 2. On what basis? It is to give away world number 1. Sell whatever you have and give to the poor. He's saying, I want you to let go world number 1 and take hold of world number 2. That's what I'm asking you to do to be perfect. Can you see clearly what he's doing is making a contrast between the 2 worlds? He's giving him something practical to do. But how do you take hold of the treasure in heaven, which you cannot see, taste, smell, touch, or hear? How do you take hold of it? Jesus was saying one way to help you to do this is to release the one that you can see. I don't know if you're getting the point that I'm making. Jesus says that in order to take a hold of the one you cannot see, it helps to let go the one that you can see. Now, I thought hard before emphasizing this point. You know why? I don't delight in being a hypocrite, and I don't want to say something that I'm not willing to embrace myself. So I wouldn't want to encourage everybody to think about this, that to obtain number 2, you need to give up number 1. I don't want to encourage anybody to do this if I'm not willing to do it myself. But it's what Jesus is saying. The point he's making is that you can never fully embrace number 2 because number 1 becomes an obstruction in the way. And if you look at it, it's a principle right throughout the Bible. Even in Psalm number 50, one of those Old Testament passages that talk about the coming of the Lord. Look at what it says. It talks about the eternal God, the mighty God has, out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God hath shined. Our God shall come and shall not keep silence. And it says in verse 5, gather my saints together unto me. Look at this strange phrase. Those that have made a covenant with me by sacrifice. A covenant is a binding agreement. God highlights that the people who are prepared for the coming of Jesus, they are the people who have bound themselves to the Lord in an unbreakable relationship by the process of sacrifice. Now let me explain something. I want to make this clear. What are we looking for? We are looking for contact with the spiritual world. We are looking for worshiping God in spirit and in truth. We are looking for the life in the spirit. That's what we are looking for. And there's a barrier in the way. There's a barrier of the senses. And God says you can break this barrier by the tool of faith. But then we have a problem with faith because faith comes and goes. And what God is saying here, now what I understand him to be saying, if you want your faith to be strong, if you want your faith to be strong, let go the treasures of this life. Let go the things that are dear to you that you can take hold of the things that you cannot see. He's giving us a hint as to how we can step across this barrier effectively. Now, I'm not going to the extent of trying to tell anybody what to sacrifice and how to sacrifice, but I'm trying to put down a principle that I see in the Bible, which is that one way of binding yourself in a faith relationship with God is by letting go your hold on the things that you can see and hear and smell and touch. By denying these senses, you can enhance the sense that enables you to see and to reach into the world to come. You see what I'm saying? There's a sense that enables you to integrate into the future world or to the world on the other side of the fence. There's a sense that can enable you to integrate into that life. But this sense is going to be weak if the physical senses are holding the paramount position in your life. See what I'm saying? This one will be strong if you weaken this one. If you strengthen this one will be weak. I'm saying this is how it works. If your five senses are actively involved in the world here, the spiritual faculty will grow weak. You will remain a Christian, but your Christianity will be on a mediocre level. I'm not saying you won't be saved. I'm not going that far. Who am I to say this? I know that many people will be saved who are weak. They were never perfect in faith. But the problem is, do you just want to be a barely saved Christian? You want to be a scoundrel barely pardoned? You want to creep into heaven on your hands and your knees? Don't you want to enter as a conqueror? Don't you want to live for the Lord here? Don't you want to be somebody that stands up and can be counted as an ambassador of our God? So I know my time is up. I know my time is up. But I just want to just say the final word, which is that this is why fasting is so helpful. Because fasting shuts off your appetite. It cuts your mouth out of the formula. It turns your eyes away from the things of the world. Even in biblical times, and I suppose today too, when people are fasting, they abstain from sexual gratification with their wives or husbands, because you deny the physical so that the spiritual can take the preeminence. That's the whole point of it. People fast because they think God is pleased by your suffering. The scribes and Pharisees said, the Pharisees said, I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. He's boasting about how much he has given for God, how much God must favor him. But fasting is not a means to soothe and appease God. Fasting is a way of putting myself in the place where my physical senses are subdued, that my spiritual senses may be elevated. So, I know I've run out of time, and they're waiting for me at the chapel. So I just want to say, I want to thank you all for your attentiveness, and I want to appreciate your listening so patiently. I just want to, I'm praying that you might have understood what I've been trying to say today, and that God may apply it to my heart also, and not just yours.